The American Revolution gets sold as a scrappy underdog story, a brave band of freedom lovers standing up to a greedy king. But here's a less flattering version. It was a tax revolt led by rich men who didn't want to pay their dues. Forget the muskets and noble speeches for a second. This was about money, power, and keeping it in the family. Welcome to Tenfold Gold, and today's history hot take. The Founding Fathers were tax-dodging elitists. If you like your history with fewer myths and more awkward truths, give this video a like, hit subscribe, and ring the bell. We've got plenty more powdered legends to take down. Point 1. Who were the Founding Fathers, really? When we talk about America's Founding Fathers, we tend to picture humble patriots with calloused hands and hearts full of liberty. But the truth is, these weren't everyday colonists. They were landowners, lawyers, financiers, and in many cases, slaveholders. Washington owned thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved people. Jefferson wrote about equality while running a plantation. Benjamin Franklin was a print magnate and political fixer. Alexander Hamilton married into money and spent much of his career protecting elite interests. These men were at the top of colonial society, educated, powerful, and absolutely invested in keeping their wealth intact. The revolution didn't start in a tavern. It started in drawing rooms, boardrooms, and counting houses. So when they said, "we the people," they mostly meant themselves. Point 2. The tax that broke the camel's back. After the 7 Years' War, which Britain fought partly to protect the American colonies, the British government found itself deep in debt. So they did what governments do. They looked for ways to raise cash. Enter the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and later the Tea Act, all mild by modern standards and mostly targeting wealthy merchants, lawyers, and landowners. The everyday colonist probably didn't notice much. But the elites, the people with the biggest estates and the longest ledgers, were furious. They saw these taxes as an overreach. Not because they were oppressive, but because they were annoying. Annoying enough to organize boycotts, print angry pamphlets, and eventually start a revolution. It's the political equivalent of a billionaire moving to a tax haven, but with muskets and dramatic speeches thrown in. So when they said tyranny, what they really meant was, stop charging me for services I don't like. Point 3. The no representation racket. No taxation without representation. It's one of the most iconic slogans in history. Catchy, righteous, and just vague enough to get printed on every bumper sticker from Boston to Boise. But here's the twist. The Founding Fathers weren't fighting for democratic representation in the British Parliament. Most of them didn't want to sit in Westminster. They just didn't want to be told what to do by people they couldn't influence. This wasn't about fairness. It was about control. The British Parliament might have been distant, but it had rules, limits, and expectations. By declaring independence, the colonial elites could scrap all that and set up a system where they wrote the rules for their benefit. So yes, no taxation without representation had a ring to it, but maybe the fuller version was no taxation unless we're the ones doing the taxing. Point 4. John Hancock, smuggler in chief. John Hancock is best known for signing the Declaration of Independence with a signature so large that it needed its own zip code. But long before that, he was one of the wealthiest men in the colonies, thanks, in large part, to smuggling. Hancock made a fortune dodging British customs duties, sneaking in everything from tea to textiles without paying a penny in tax. He wasn't a freedom fighter, he was a black market tycoon. And when the British finally seized one of his ships, the Liberty no less, he didn't respond with calm diplomacy. He whipped up a mob, stirred unrest, and played the martyr. The seizure became a rallying cry for resistance. But let's be honest, it was just the tax office doing its job. Hancock's revolution wasn't about liberty. It was about protecting his bottom line and dressing it up in red, white, and blue. Point 5. Tea time tantrum. Ah yes, the Boston Tea Party, the moment freedom-loving colonists heroically dumped crates of tea into the harbor in protest against tyranny. Except, it wasn't quite that noble. The Tea Act of 1773 didn't actually raise taxes. It lowered the price of British tea to undercut smugglers, like John Hancock. The East India Company got a monopoly, the legal tea got cheaper, and the black market got clobbered. So who threw the tantrum? Not ordinary drinkers. It was wealthy merchants and political agitators protecting their turf. They dressed up like Mohawk warriors, not exactly subtle, and trashed a shipment of tea that wasn't even theirs. The crown didn't lose revenue. A private company lost stock. It wasn't a strike against oppression, it was a brand war. And the message wasn't, don't tax us, it was, don't mess with our profits. Point 6. Slaveholders for freedom, just not for everyone. When Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, he did it from a plantation powered by enslaved labor. He wasn't alone. George Washington, James Madison, Patrick Henry, many of the founding fathers owned people while drafting documents about liberty. It's the historical equivalent of launching a human rights campaign from inside a bank vault full of shackles. Slavery wasn't an unfortunate side detail. It was central to their wealth, status, and political power. And it wasn't just tolerated, it was protected. The American Revolution didn't end slavery. If anything, it gave slaveholding elites the freedom to expand it without British interference. They spoke eloquently about chains of tyranny, while literally chaining human beings. So yes, they fought for freedom, just not for everyone. Point 7. The Constitution was built to protect property. The U.S. Constitution gets held up as a shining beacon of freedom, but underneath the soaring language and calligraphy, it's basically a fortress for property rights. The Founding Fathers weren't writing a guide to universal liberty. They were designing a system to protect what they owned: land, wealth, and slaves. The Constitution limited direct democracy, created checks and balances to prevent mob rule, and carefully avoided mentioning slavery while still protecting it. Why? Because the men in the room were overwhelmingly rich, white, and heavily invested in the status quo. Even the famous phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was originally life, liberty, and property, a Freudian slip if ever there was one. They weren't just founding a nation, they were ring-fencing their assets with parchment and ink. Point 8. Native land, now tax-free. Do you want to know one of the lesser-known reasons the Founding Fathers wanted independence? Land, specifically indigenous land. Before the Revolution, the British Crown had imposed restrictions on westward expansion with the Proclamation Line of 1763, an attempt to prevent colonists from grabbing land beyond the Appalachians and kicking off more bloody frontier wars. This infuriated wealthy colonists, including George Washington and Ben Franklin, who had their eyes, and in some cases, investments, on those western territories. Independence removed the brakes. Suddenly, there was no royal oversight, no pesky treaties, and no limits on how far they could push. The new American government wasted no time, sending settlers, surveyors, and soldiers across the frontier. Indigenous resistance was met with force. The revolution wasn't just about taxes, it was also about clearing the path, literally, for an empire of their own. Point 9. Britain abolished slavery before the United States did. Here's a historical curveball they don't teach in school. The British Empire, yes, the one the colonists rebelled against, abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833. The United States took another 3 decades and a full-blown civil war to catch up. That's not to say Britain was morally superior. They'd built their empire on slavery too, but they at least pulled the plug without needing 500,000 bodies at Gettysburg. Many of the Founding Fathers had the chance to address slavery in their new republic. They didn't. Instead, they protected it. They wrote it into the Constitution by omission, allowing it to fester and expand. For all the talk of liberty, it was Britain, the supposed tyrant, that got to abolition first. The land of the free wasn't as keen for a long time. Point 10. The founding myth sells well, but history sells better. We love a good origin story, especially one with powdered wigs, stirring speeches, and a noble cause. But the truth is always messier. The American Revolution wasn't just a fight for freedom. It was a rebranding exercise for the elite, a chance to turn self-interest into statehood. Yes, they built a nation, but they also built it on a foundation of wealth, inequality, and calculated spin. They dodged taxes, defended slavery, grabbed land, and called it liberty. And over time, that myth of brave underdogs defying tyranny became national gospel. But here's the thing, the real history isn't unpatriotic. It's just honest. You can still admire the ideals without ignoring the motives, because if the Founding Fathers taught us anything, It's that the best stories don't always tell the whole truth, but they sell. So the next time someone quotes the Founding Fathers like they were sacred prophets, just remember, they were closer to boardroom strategists than battlefield martyrs. They didn't spark a revolution for everyone. They sparked it for themselves, and they were smart enough to sell it as freedom. If this video made you rethink what you thought you knew, give it a like. And if you want more history that skips the sugarcoating and gets right to the bone, hit subscribe and ring the bell. This is Tenfold Gold, and we'll see you next time. Probably demolishing another national treasure with nothing but facts and a mildly sarcastic voiceover.